So I'm going to launch in. You have an incredible varied background. What brought you to filmmaking specifically?
Well, I suppose same thing that brought me to every other medium, that I had a work that I realized needed to be made in film. And so, I mean, well, originally the whole of Alice in some ways grows out of a character in a 2017 theatre script called Declaration of Independence, which was never put on in the United Kingdom for a variety of reasons, probably because various theatre critics, including Michael Billington, were immolated and executed in effigy. But anyway, there was a character in that where who wore a balaclava throughout and was throwing rocks and various things, and then took off the balaclava, and then took off her face, and then took off her skin, and then took off her bones to try find something underneath all of it. And somehow she grew into some of the ideas of Alice, and the ideas that were grown into at that she grew into at that point also involved a key that wouldn't work in a lock anymore, and various other things along the way that would only really work with incredibly fast juxtaposition, and would only really work with incredibly bright colors, frantic cutting, and generally things that one couldn't do on a stage. And I do take the view that most things can be done on a stage.
Okay.
To be clear, film is a discipline that I adore and for which I have the greatest respect. But for precisely that reason, the last thing I would ever want to do would be to have an idea and say, well, I am a filmmaker and therefore I shall impose film on this idea, because I think that denigrates both the idea and the medium.
No, I agree with you. I think that's a good way to approach it. And sort of, I was reading a couple of interviews and reading more about Alice, and one thing in particular that sort of comes across with you is you like to invent new work, things that haven't been seen before.
Yes.
Do you think that that is still possible? I mean, we live in a world where everything is sort of replicated and copied.
Well, have you read Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent?
I haven't, no.
Okay, so Eliot, the best part of a century ago, and the extensive use of quotation that I do everywhere and in every form obviously goes to show that to some extent I do think that it's necessary to draw on the past. But he points out correctly that every new significant artistic achievement retrospectively rewrites everything that came before it, because if it doesn't relate to it, it's simply a fruitless branch that counts for nothing, which also means that every work of the past that doesn't have new things being made built upon it is a fruitless work that can't serve anything and that becomes useless by not having descendants. I suppose the short answer to your question is yes, it is possible to invent new things. And the reason it's possible to invent new things is because we see the world in new ways. If there's any one, I don't want to say project because that sounds both pretentious and it's a lie, but if there is any one thing that I've found myself in the last few works that I've done, it is in various forms. It's wrestling with the problem of what it means to be an I in the present, where our actual experience of the present is not the Dickensian linear, we have an origin story, as they would call it in tech companies. And then we go on and we do this thing and we do that thing and we come to a pretty conclusion. No, rather our existence is one where this happens and that happens, or even just that person says something and talks and talks and talks, and then somebody else talks and talks and talks. And the entire world is changed by it, and radically so, to the point where any pretense at a story is absurd. And I don't think that's something that previous generations have had. And I think one of the challenges of art in our present is how do we depict and express that the way that other people expressed other presents, rather than saying, well, Dickens was good at stuff. Or even to take people I love, Eliot was good at stuff. Let's do that again. And so, can you remember who Chris Pincher was?
The name rings a bell, but
Okay, well,
remind
quite.
me.
So about a little under 3 months ago, he was the person who brought down the government of Great Britain through a sex scandal that he was involved in. So much has
Right, that's
happened.
where the
So,
name's ringing a
yeah,
bell
yeah, yeah.
from.
He was on the front page of every newspaper, even in Europe, for quite a while. And so much has happened in the 3 months intervening that big event is completely lost. Of course, you don't
Yeah.
remember who he is. Frankly, I had to look up his name in case I was asked a question. I mean, that's really my point. But so, yes, art, one can invent new things, and art has to be different now because that's the world we live in.
Yeah. No, beautiful. So with Alice and everything that's going on and everything that you've drawn from, how did you go about putting that into a script which could then go into production?
Well, I mean, to be honest, in the traditional way. So I've got this software package called Scrivener. It's really lovely. It lets you write scenes and it lets you order them. And um, I I didn't, well, I mean, what I didn't do was plan a plot or anything
Okay.
along those lines. A series of scenes existed and needed to be put down on paper. And from them, I grew to understand what other scenes were necessarily there. I grew to understand that I was leaning heavily on Slavoj Žižek, Lenka Zupančić, Mladen Dolar, and I realized that to a point they were haunting Alice's attempts to be a character, and therefore they do come indeed to haunt her, and they do indeed appear in the nightmares. And everything, I suppose, flowed that way. Basically, in every form in which I work, the technical questions, like with a holographic drama, which was one of my other previous things, there's I mean, why on earth would one do it? What can be done in that form that can't be done in another form? But then when one gets to actually making the work, to me, it's really simply a case of trusting my instincts. I certainly don't seek to impose myself on the work or ever to decide it must do this. It's a very instinctive process, to be honest.
Yeah. And so then once everything is put together, I mean, it would be silly of me not to mention your wonderful cast. How did you assemble them and how did you put the script to them?
Well, so first up was the issue of casting Alice, and that was a tricky one. And I think 1,400 or something like that people put themselves forward for the role.
Wow.
And it was very, very difficult because to be honest, I'm not used to that world. And the business of self-tapes is a difficult one for any actor. And it is one where it's virtually impossible to present yourself on video, which is what happens in the first instance. And, we cut it down to 40 or 50. And I'm sure that there were other brilliant people on whom I've missed out, but I was very, very lucky that one of them was simply unbelievably brilliant, instinctively exactly what I had in mind. And wonderfully, we've come to be very, very good friends after the production. And her views on theatre and art, which are strong and intelligent, are in most places the opposite to mine. And it's the most wonderful thing. And we never had those chats, Saskia and I, up until filming finished.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was difficult to cast her. As for the others, Stephen and I Stephen Burkhoff was a great inspiration to me when I was very young, because I grew up in Cape Town and we didn't really have avant-garde literature there. We had the Kafta secondhand bookshop where I went for a lot of my text, and I discovered some of his plays when I was very young. And then I saw a bunch of his work. And when during lockdown, South African National Arts Festival got hold of me and suggested I might like to do a work for them for their first online thing, which was very important to them, and anybody I'd like to get involved. I spoke to Stephen and he was up for it, and we became very good. Well, unless he says otherwise, we've become very good friends. No, he's wonderful and brilliant, and I learned so much from him. Then as for the others, I suppose people were just up for it. I mean, I think that one of the things that is unusual for me is that for the most part, I don't like young British actors.
Okay.
And it's not their fault. it's the fault of the tradition in which they've been brought up, and I adore and revere a generation of elderly radicals, people like Alan Ford, people like Carol, indeed the whole Monty Python crew, people like Vanessa Redgrave. And I think that it was very nice for them to have a work that was as radical as the stuff that they were doing when they were growing up. Ken Russell films, Monty Python, Nicholas Roeg, all of that sort of thing, as opposed to fairly saccharine, heartfelt, but fairly normal sort of stuff that is basically what one can do at the moment. And so it was fun to basically go all out on a limb with a bunch of my heroes, I suppose.
Good. Well, wonderful. What do you think is holding cinema back at the moment? Why do you think that we're in a period of the saccharine, as you said?
Well, a number of things. I mean, the obvious one is money and access, which is to say, on the access side, that anybody can shoot anything they want with an iPhone at the moment, but there is so much of a proliferation of stuff that to create what I suppose you mean by cinema, which is dramatic video stuff as an art form as opposed to content, is something that necessarily is competing with everything else that is filmed, and indeed a bunch of stuff that isn't filmed, and competing with 24-hour rolling news, which, I mean, you know, in terms of the sort of stuff I talk about with Alice, I regard 24-hour rolling news as serious competition in terms of purely of satire. And so, I mean, it's very hard that way. And because it's very hard that way, the financial environment then, of course, also becomes very hard because, you know, everybody involved in a production needs to live a normal civilized life, and either needs to be paid or needs ideally to be paid by the state in order to go about doing these things. I mean, I'm a radical leftist, but the point is a brother's got to eat. And the problem is that necessarily studios themselves are not making money. They've diverted to the most reliable things that they can, which are franchise pieces. I mean, sort of, there's a scene in Blackadder where Blackadder describes that he kicks the dog bites the cat bites the rat.
I know what you're referring
the
to.
rat bites Baldrick on the arse. I mean, if we start with the fact that Brian De Palma and people like that struggle to make movies because the 30 to 50 million movie just doesn't exist anymore. It's now either huge stuff or tiny stuff.
Yeah.
The whole thing sort of it falls downwards. And to be fair, that's true. I mean, this isn't a cinema-specific problem. One has similar sorts of problems in music, and one which, I mean, different but equally severe. And in most theatre environments, other than, thank God, Germany and Austria, where I'm privileged to live in Germany, you have the same budgetary problems. So, I mean,
it's like you said, it's a trickle-down effect.
Well, it's the one thing that does actually trickle down. Poverty trickles down, wealth trickles up. But yes, and then also, I suppose, just the loss of the status of art as such. I mean, you know, it's highly. I don't know that someone like Alain Robbe-Grillet or even Godard would be very comfortable being called an artist because they wanted to be a radical in the 60s, and quite rightly. But they got to be radicals because there was a status of conventional great art that they could rail against. Conventional great art as a form is something that is heavily diluted at the moment, which is terribly unfortunate.
No,
I mean, just to throw one other fun one at you. So, at the time when Lolita was being written, or Naked Lunch, or various things like that, there were great obscenity trials over literature, and the only defense of serious obscenity was that it was also serious art, that it had serious thought and artistic craft and all of those things going into it. And in effect, what you would be doing is you'd be hiding the smut in the art, Whereas in the present, we have reached the point where, to some extent, in order to do art, one does sort of have to hide the art in the smut. But yes, anyway,
that's a really good way of putting it.
That's a very long answer to your very valid question.
No, I enjoy a long answer. So with Alice as well, obviously there's some controversial scenes. You're dealing with some sort of brilliant ideas, which some people might rail against. Were you wanting to be controversial? Was it just something that comes naturally to you?
Well, I don't wake up every morning and have my first cup of coffee, have my second cup of coffee and my first cigarette, and then think, right, who am I going to annoy today? But at the same time, I do think that art, like politics, is something that is meant to divide rather than unify. And if one's not picking the side that one's on, or creating something that one knows is so far down a particular route that a lot of people aren't going to like it, then I do rather question whether one should be doing what one's doing. If that answers the question at all.
That does, that answers it perfectly. So this is going to be your UK premiere at London Rocks. But how have you found the reception so far to the film?
Delightfully divisive, exactly as I might have hoped.
Brilliant.
I've been very amused by people who don't like it, saying that it takes itself too seriously, where, I mean, I think that the last person who should ever comment on the meaning of a film or anything like that is the filmmaker. I think, first of all, they've got no right, and second of all, it's a mistake I made with the previous work once previously, and I shall never do it again. But certainly I don't regard it as a terribly serious work. It deals with terribly serious things, and then there are other people who have either loved it or found it funny and excruciating, which is all of which is great.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly I see it as a work that is designed to create problems in one's response rather than to elicit a particular response. So
okay,
I'm happy with that.
Good. I think that's a good way to think about it. And anything these days that, starts a conversation. You don't want someone just to think, oh, that was enjoyable. There's got to be something more to it.
Well, Brecht says if one wants to write a poem that will be of use, then one's job as a poet is to keep it incomplete, because the completion comes with what people do with it afterwards. And so, I mean, I do broadly have that sense. I also think that because I'm not working with traditional narrative, 3-act plots, anything like that, and I am working with juxtaposition, the very form in which I'm working means almost inevitably they're going to be bits that anybody won't like. And that's fine. It's also interesting because I discovered that the way that I consume so many works is very different to the way other people do, in that I'm very happy to, on a Thursday evening, watch 7 minutes from 7 different films, because I really want to explore. I really want to explore an idea, and I remember they did that, and I saw a work at Riga International Film Festival, which I shan't name because, at risk of damning it with faint praise, even though I don't mean to, I think it was an exceptional film. I thought the first 40 minutes of it were like nothing I'd seen in a long, long time, really radical. And then I thought the second 50 were lyrical and in a dull and banal way. And therefore I thought it was one of the best works I'd seen in an incredibly long time.
Okay.
And so I don't know what that says about me, but it probably goes some way to answering the question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You are clearly a man who has many different influences and sort of so many things that inspire you. Who would you say you pulled from in the making of Alice?
Right. Well, I mean, the obvious ones are T.S. Eliot, who makes an appearance, Godard, who's riffed off on a regular basis, Monty Python to a point, Alain Robbe-Grillet, I suppose musically, Scott Walker's late works were quite significant. Then let me think. Alfredi Jelinek in terms of the formal style of it. Indeed, I tried to write a scene for Jelinek in the original draft of it, of course, but of course she doesn't leave her house and wouldn't leave her house even for me. So we had to ditch that one. She was going to be in conversation with Golan Bart, which I thought would have been a wonderful scene. But then philosophically, Alen Badiou, Slavoj Žižek, Mladen Dola, Lenka Zupancic, the last three of them also appear in the film. And then, I don't know, I'm sure there are a bunch of others, but I mean, that's a starter for 10.
Yeah, that's the start of it. So I touched on this earlier, but we sort of didn't delve into it. What is your process with your actors? So when you audition them, do you give them the script? Do you give them a reading? How does that flow?
Basically, well, I mean, it depends who it is. I don't think I'm speaking out of school in saying that Vanessa was never going to do a self-tape for me.
Fair enough.
Vanessa Redgrave. So, I mean, it really does depend, but certainly in terms of working with them on set, which is, actually, no, let me roll back. Let me say that my process for this film was very different with Alice and everybody else in the film, because I had a real sense that Alice is not only in virtually every scene, but whether we are looking through Alice's eyes or askance at Alice, or how we approach Alice versus the view of the film, is something that is heavily in the film. And what I really tried to do with Saskia was to rehearse extensively with her before, to the point where the character basically became hers, and not to tell her this, do this, do that, do the other, but to make it something where I'm very, very against giving backstories and anything like that. And all of these sort of things under the character. I'm very relaxed for actors to have an active role in the process and be inventing those themselves for themselves. And that's a way in which they bring something that I could never bring, just writing it and directing it and all of those things. And so we worked hard to make Alice a character that we both instinctively knew, no matter what happened when the camera was rolling, sort of where Alice would go, and, slight alterations, but nothing more. And then for the other characters, what we were working on was a lot more stylistic. There, again, many, many different views of this production, but you're familiar with the Bechdel test.
Yes.
So Saskia is, as am I, an ardent feminist, but we have slightly different views on the Bechdel test as a serious tool. But we did discuss it and came, I think, jointly to the conclusion that it would probably be fair to say that Alice doesn't pass the Bechdel test, which, of course, famously is whether there are ever two female characters having a discussion about something which isn't a man, because there are not two characters in the film. So far as real characters go, there is only Alice. And then there are a bunch of impetuses and things and bodies that speak, as Mladen Dola puts it. And so I suppose the creative process with all of the other actors, was really a stylistic process, far closer to what Robert Wilson would do on stage, say, with his choreographic processes and stylistic, than what would be, I suppose, conventional in a character-driven feature or something along those lines.
Yeah.
This isn't always the way I work, though admittedly in holographic drama, probably 80% of my rehearsal time was agreeing with people how they would walk. But it is, I suppose, something that I think is very interesting, again, about older British actors and indeed some younger German actors, that the stylistic is something, and just physical control is something that one can work with so much. And something that I really like to do.
And that brings so much. I mean, that's what I think that's what you're able to feel when you watch a film. Yes. That really comes through.
I mean, Lars von Trier had a very lovely line that long before I started making films, I think I was probably 17 at the time, and I was given this book of interviews with great directors or masterclasses or whatever the hell you would call it. And he made the argument that that anybody who's a half-decent craftsman in film should be able to do anything. There's no triumph in doing anything, no matter how complicated. The triumph is in creating in your own terms a work, and that's done by what it excludes rather than by what it includes. And that has stuck with me.
Okay.
Many people would probably take the view that I fail at it time and time again because of my wild divergences in form and all of that. But indeed, precisely those divergences in form are what I demand of my works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So how, I mean, I suppose this is a big question. How are you going to move into your next film now, having made Alice?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I already have read A Terrible and Wonderful Accident. Well, I hadn't had a large-scale work that I'm hoping I shall film in 2024, and it is entitled Petra Pan. It's actually a coincidence that it's another, I suppose, fairy tale-based thing, but that all started with the ending of Tennessee Williams' Sweet Bird of Youth, which is, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm going to screw up the quote. I ask not that you sympathize with me. Of course you can't do that. I don't even ask for your empathy. I just ask that you recognize in me, as in you, the enemy, time in all things. And I had that quote, and I had, well, I suppose a series of dramas. And I had a rock musician, a female rock musician named Petra Pan. For whatever reason, sort of the characters with whom I identify most always end up being female in my works. I have no idea why this is. I'm sure one should do deep psychoanalytic reading, but anyway. But a female rock musician before a time of great change and who never grows old, and where she is a great radical and the world changes around her, and 30 years later, her partner Wendy is 30 years older, and everybody is 30 years older except for her. And she finds herself doing exactly what she always did, but being completely irrelevant and somewhat pathetic for that reason. And this is a work that I'm hoping I will be filming mostly in Riga. Okay. And I had ambitions to be filming it next year, but I now have a bunch of other things on next year, some of which I can talk about, some of which I can't. So the whole thing's been pushed a year. But in the midst of all of this, I met a delightful performance artist who is now an actress at Tallinn Film Festival, where Alice premiered. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that she has, for some of my writing, become a bit of a muse of sort. Daniela Vetra, and she was down here, and she mentioned a desire to put on a performance artwork or theater work where a woman gave birth to 1 billion babies while a room filled up with milk from her breasts. And so I said to her, well, funnily enough, I've already got the script for that. You can borrow it if you want. I'm not using it for anything. It's the first half an hour of this 5.5-hour theater work. And so she gratefully took that. She's now putting it on in Riga. And I went to film a trailer for it. And we had so much fun doing it. And indeed working with Arturs Vitmanis, who is an incredible Regan, New York Regan artist who also does production design from time to time. And the three of us are working on developing Petra together, actually. And had so much fun doing it that we decided, in between the various other things we have on, we're going to take this theater script, develop it into a 90-minute film. That is, strip 4.5 hours out of it, and shoot various scenes along the way. And I'm not sure what this is going to end up as. I know that it will end up very angry and very dark. And I know that I have shot the first 4 days of it, or probably the first 15 minutes of it. And I'm very, very happy with what I've shot. Okay. So I mean, there's that. But that's, people, to my genuine bewilderment, called Alice, which I regarded as probably the most conservative work I've done in a long time, is experimental. And I suppose there is an element with this next work was, if you want to call my work experimental, this is what you're going to get. But But I suppose that's really a grand, fun experiment, which also takes me back to, how I would work when I was younger without big crews and big thises and big that's, and which we're doing while we work towards another larger thing there and in between a bunch of other projects. And I expect that Petra is going to be a fusion of, I suspect, probably mostly British and German with some Latvian actors. Shooting mostly in Latvia, a bit in Germany, hopefully a bit in the United Kingdom, if you still have a country then. And yeah, I mean, that's basically the way it's going. Although in the midst of all of that, I've also got my first purely musical work that I'm doing next year, which I'm very excited about. Working with the theatre director Birgit Ibsen on a production of Kafka's America, where I'm using a great many speakers and doing a score and writing things, which is highly positional, and I'm really very excited about that too.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Brilliant. Right, well then my final question for you, because otherwise this transcription is going to take me far too long. So you have your films that you're working on, you have your holograms, you have your music. How do you balance everything, and how do you prioritize different things as well?
Badly. I suppose, look, like most people, I've got more things in my life that I would like to do than I will ever do. That's the nature of being human.
Mm-hmm.
And in certain of the cases, what's needed to do a work is a lot of money. In certain of the cases, it's a lot of time. In certain of the cases, it's the right people. And so I suppose I find myself in stupid periods for months on end, where I'm absolutely convinced that I'm going to do these 3 or 4 things. And then what happens is that somewhere along the way, irrelevant of money or time, or even sometimes people, one of them just comes along and for whatever reason takes me over completely. And then that is the thing that must happen.
So it's a natural sort of process.
Well, the way the Blues Brothers describe it is being on a mission from God. The way our tour describes a vendor of hot dogs in New York, where I think they're Hasidic, describes their slogan as being, "We answer to higher authority." And at a certain point, one does just get the feeling in one's soul that one is answering to higher authority. Mm-hmm. And at that point, one does whatever is necessary to complete a work. And then one feels for a few brief moments that one can absolutely and happily die at that point. And then one loses that feeling and one has to move on to something else.
I think that's a great way to approach it. Well, Adam, look, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Greatest pleasure.
And I'm very looking forward to meeting you this time next week.
I look forward immensely, and likewise. The show is, I think, at 8 p.m. and then we have a Q&A afterwards, if I recall.
It is indeed.
Yes.